Hey everyone, my name is Chris A, and today I'm going to be doing something a little different from what I normally do. Today's video is going to be more of a podcast format, unscripted, long form, and I have a guest with me. I've split this into two different parts. This is part two of two, so if you haven't watched the first part, I'll put a link in the description below. Let me know if you like this kind of video. This is just a new format that I'm trying out. I'd love to do more of this in the future. It was a lot of fun. In this video, we are going to be talking about the Haunting of Bly Manor, so obviously spoiler alert for that series. We're also going to get into some pretty deep stuff, so we've got content warnings for things like suicide, mental illness, terminal illness, and death. And if you're okay with all that, then like, comment, and subscribe, and enjoy the rest of the video. Thanks. Another thing that I really loved is um, I have this fear of sleep.
Me too.
I have a lot of fears, but part of it comes from a couple of years ago. I woke up and my cat was dead, and she died in her sleep, presumably, and so now I am terrified of sleep because you could never wake up. And I'm less terrified about it for myself as for I struggle sleeping when my wife sleeps because what if she dies in her sleep,
Yeah, it's like, what's going to happen when I let go of control?
Exactly. Yep. Same with the cats. Like I will, every 20 minutes I'll call the cat's name just so I know that it's okay, even if it's sleeping. So this idea of Danny wakes up and she's got her hands around Jamie's throat was really powerful. Like you're saying, what happens when I lose control? And also the acceptance of, drawing a boundary. And this is something that, I dealt with recently with my stepfather's passing. Was at what point do we, stop? At what point is it less about recovery and more about end of life? And obviously in Haunting of Bly Manor, it's very supernatural. It's, well, once my possession becomes harmful, that's when it's over. But that is a real thing we have to think about in life. When will I be sick enough that I am a detriment to my family? And I hate to say detriment like that, but when am I sick enough that my quality of life is so diminished and I'm, again, I hate to use this word, but a burden. And I've been very frank about this. Like, a sick person that you have to take care of is on paper a burden. Yeah. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. That doesn't mean you love them any less. Just because there's a physical demand or a emotional demand, even, we still love burdens. We still want burdens to survive.
Right. And while it can be a burden, it can also be a great gift to be able to spend time with them.
Yeah.
As well.
So this idea of, Danny has made the decision of, once I become a threat to my loved one, then that's when I'm going to take my life, basically. And, unfortunately we don't have, this is like, I'm a strong believer in physician assisted suicide or euthanasia. I think people should have the right to choose to die if they are sick. Obviously, I think if you're a healthy person who is dealing with suicidal ideation, that's a different story. But if you are in your 70s and you have cancer and you've got 3 months to live, and those 3 months are going to be filled with chemo appointments, and unfortunately, without physician assisted suicide, the alternative is suicide. And that's what Danny does, right? She walks into the lake. Again, a lot of the story has more supernatural elements than in real life.
Right.
But it certainly it deals with things that people are really dealing with.
Yeah. Yeah. In Danny's in the end of Danny and Jamie's story, and like the moments where you're watching them go one day at a time together, I do think that they did a really good job of representing that fear of like Danny looking in a reflective surface and constantly seeing this monster and just knowing that it's getting closer and closer. And like you said, the moment where she wakes up with her, she's on top of Jamie, and that to me is like such a great representation of the fear of falling asleep and not knowing what's going to happen while you're gone, while you're out of control. And that's a thing that comes up for me a lot in therapy, where it's like, why is it that I am so afraid to fall asleep? Why is it that my adrenaline spikes at 10:30 p.m. and I like get a manic rush of energy? Why is it that I start seeing things when I close my eyes when I'm going to sleep? Like, most nights I literally feel like I'm about to die, and I don't really know how to explain it. It's like this is, it's just a loss of control, I think is what it boils down to. It's like, if I let go of my control, then inevitably the result is something fatal, something terrible. And every night it's proven to me that that's not exactly the case, but like, I can't let go of that thought.
Yeah, and for me, it's kind of like the law of very large numbers, where I have slept every day of my life, and one of those days it's going to be bad.
Yeah.
And that may be true. And maybe when I'm 80, I will die in my sleep. Maybe when I'm 60, I'll die in my sleep. But certainly at my age now, that's unlikely. But every day it gets likelier. Very, very in a very small increment, but because of the way my brain works. And another thing with OCD is I have more or less predicted every terrible thing that has ever happened to me, because I'm constantly predicting that terrible things are going to happen. So I'm wrong 99% of the time, but the 1% that I was like, oh yeah, coronavirus is going to last a year and a half. Like I was pretty much right about that. Or it would appear that we are on our way. I was before everything locked down, I was freaking out. I was like, this is a big deal. I couldn't watch. I don't know if you remember, but like early March, Seth Meyers was making jokes about coronavirus. They did a sketch on SNL, and I'm like, this thing I couldn't watch any of that because I knew what was coming. And I would have felt that way even if it turned out to be nothing. But because it didn't, there's kind of this confirmation bias of, well, you got that one right. So now we're going to keep predicting that terrible things are going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the falling asleep thing has to do with it, is like every night I predict that I will die in my sleep, or that someone will die in their sleep. And eventually that's going to come true.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And so I also like how, we talked about dementia a little bit, but also just terminal illnesses in general seem to be reflected in kind of the end of Danny's story. This idea of, I talked about kind of obsessive compulsive and predictions and that kind of thing, but it's probably closer to having a terminal illness, where she knows she has this thing and she knows eventually it's going to take her life, but you're just going through day to day, and some days are good, some days are bad, and that's very true of dementia, certainly, and I'm sure many other terminal illnesses, where Some days it's really hard, and some days it's a breeze.
Yeah, it's also true of depression.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really cool how her haunting was reflective of a terminal illness. And, she knew at some point she was going to die because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, there is something kind of, again, I think oversimplified about these days that she's waiting to die, basically. I think like it's a little bit like too romantic to believe that the days would just be like happy. Like, I don't know, like it seems like they keep having like, all things considered, pretty okay days together. Like she has her moments where she sort of freaks out and then she comes back to this like lovey-dovey life that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, it's like a little bit unfair. I think that in reality, no matter how you sort of see her haunting as a terminal illness, as a mental illness, as her just believing that she is fundamentally flawed and eventually she's going to snap, like any of those things would require a little bit of like messy moments. Like she would be lashing out at Jamie. And I think especially considering her life before Jamie, there's just the fact that as soon as they're together, they're just together and everything is nice.
So let me throw something in there, because ultimately the whole show is told from the point of view of Jamie.
Mm-hmm.
And like we talked about, after we lose people, we often idealize them or distill their memory down. So I'm wondering how much of that is, kind of an unreliable narrator. What's the word? An unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
I agree, though. I think there is, I think, are you familiar with The Simpsons?
Vaguely.
Okay.
Like, go ahead.
I have to bring everything back to some other media, of course. But there's an episode where Homer is fed. So there's a certain type of blowfish that, if you cook it wrong, it kills you or something. Or if you cut the wrong part, it's fatal. So there's an episode where he eats this potentially deadly sushi, and it ends up that he ate the bad part. And so the doctor says, you have 24 hours to live. And so he makes this list of, what am I going to do? And I think so often we have that kind of romanticization of, well, once I know someone's going to die, we're going to go to Everest. We're going to go to the Bahamas. We're going to do this bucket list thing. When the reality is, unfortunately, life goes on. If someone you love is going to die in 3 months, well, unfortunately, you can't spend 3 months catering to that person. You certainly do everything you can to take care of them, but part of taking care of them is making a living and being able to afford, egregious medical bills, which don't exist in any other industrialized nation in the world. But that's what you find. And that's what I found with my mother is like, if I knew she was going to die tomorrow, I would drop everything. If I knew she was going to die in 5 years, you make the most of it, certainly, but you can't just turn everything into their bucket list. Right. So I think I kind of lost my train of thought, but
it's the unreliable narrator for sure. And I didn't think about that.
Right. It's just this idea of like you're saying, yeah, if you know someone's going to die, it's not all like, we're just going to make the most of it like that. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. Especially if it's long term. And I think it's like 5 years that before Danny is eventually taken.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's totally what it is.
And that I'm wondering if that explains the children too.
Yeah.
Just the fact that but it's also, it also begs the question, like, how did she know a lot of this? Like,
Mm-hmm.
she wasn't around for everything.
Right.
Um,
What did you make of the ending, that she was telling the story to Flora the entire time, and it was Flora's wedding day, and somehow all of the people had aged enough to be cast as new actors, but like Flora is, I mean, how old is she? Maybe 20 something,
yeah.
maybe 30 something. So how many years could have possibly passed?
Yeah, in general, that didn't that well, and then there's the question, right, of, is like, is she just telling a story? Is she
Right.
just like, I'm going to spin this yarn and I'm going to put you in the story, but it's just totally made up, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um I don't know. I feel like I didn't love it. I don't think I don't think it needed to be Flora. I think, honestly, it almost would have been more powerful if it wasn't. If it was
Mm-hmm.
just like, Jamie is so haunted by her memories that she's at a wedding and she can't help but talk about these terrible things. Like, that to me
Yeah.
would resonate a little bit more. Just this idea, because maybe you're the same way, but I have this tendency to just like get really dark and really deep really fast.
Oh yeah.
Um, and part of that is, I use humor as a coping mechanism. So I'm able to tell dark jokes
Mm-hmm.
about people that I've lost. And for me, that is, a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. So, um,
But
so in
that's kind
that,
of part of it too. It's like, how dare you act like life is normal? Like,
yeah,
I will make you uncomfortable.
yeah,
And I do sort of feel like, I don't know if they represented it this way, but I sort of imagined Jamie being kind of vindictive when she finds out from Owen that the kids don't even remember what happened, that somehow they have this strange experience of their memories of the house were kind of wiped. Like,
mm-hmm.
they've had this repressed memory experience potentially. And so all of the people that were most harmed by the house, who lost real people to the house, are left with the burden of carrying the reality of it. It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
like the memory of the person you lost only being the good things. Like, these kids get to have this memory of the house just being like normal.
Yeah,
And then when Jamie hears that, she's like, what the fuck? Like, it's almost like a personal like blow, because she's like, we're living our lives literally Danny is holding the ghost inside of her that almost took those children away,
mm-hmm.
and they don't even remember it. Like, fuck
Yeah,
you. So they're kind of like, she comes to this wedding to be kind of like, you guys really don't fucking remember this? I dare you to
interesting,
try it.
interesting.
But I don't think she
Um,
really acts that way, but I think that I would probably if I were her.
well, it's like what you said earlier about, when you had lost your father at a young age, um, you have kind of this child's memory of him, or through everyone else's memory. Whereas people who are adults, when they lost him, presumably hold a lot more and a lot more complex feelings. Um, so I think that feels reflective of the reality. This idea that the kids and again, maybe it goes back to this idea of they were so innocent, they didn't realize anything weird happened.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah, or maybe their uncle, who was Flora's father.
Yeah, the uncle.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about the uncle. I want to get there in a minute, but maybe he was just telling them what he wanted them to remember. And like, I will say, like, from my own personal ghost stories, like my brother and I both had this experience of seeing some entity peeking into our bedroom at night. And like our house growing up, we all shared a hallway. So it was like my brother's room, my mom's room, and there's the hallway. So, you know, I didn't know that he was experiencing this, and I didn't know that anybody else in the house was until recently. So I have these memories from when I was a child. I'm assuming I was just seeing shadows or whatever. I'm like, I don't actually know. Like when I blinked, they would probably disappear, and it was so long ago, and I don't remember real things that happened from that time in my life. So like, there's no way this is a real thing. And then, you know, like my mom and my brother and I are around the kitchen table, maybe like 2 years ago or something, and my brother references this thing, and my mom's like, wait, you saw that too? And I'm like, no, are you serious? Me too. And like my partner Tommy is there, and he's constantly like witnessing this kind of shit happening, and he's like, how am I in a real ass haunted house? Like, he's sort of the objective like person watching, which is also
has he witnessed anything?
No.
Okay no. So that
yeah, and it's like, it's almost like Owen's character in Bly is sort of this objective person who experiences mostly the reality of what's going on, right? Like he doesn't really see any of the ghosts. And it's so, I think it's very cool to have one of those characters be present all of the time, because in a ghost story, I think usually you have these objective characters come in and out just to be able to be like, y'all are crazy. And then the crazy people go back to their life. But to have someone who's constantly like maybe a grounding presence involved in the narrative, I think is really cool, because it sort of blurs the line some more about like, well, what is the haunting and what is the reality of like being a human haunted by trauma? So what was I saying about that? Oh, that like I could have very well gone on with my life being, you know, like whatever. Oh, that wasn't a real thing. Like that house definitely wasn't haunted. That would be a crazy thing to believe, because I was like 7 or whatever, however old Flora was. But then, you know, as soon as someone sort of breaks that, you're like, oh wait, and then you start to question everything, and it's like, maybe no one has broken that. Maybe that's what Jamie was trying to do, to make them realize all of the cracks in their perfect memory.
So I want to, one thing I want to come back to. Okay. So, cause maybe I misunderstood. I thought there was some ambiguity as to the identity of older Flora, because does she still have an accent as an adult?
No, she doesn't.
See, that's what confused me, is like, I was
but when you look at IMDb, it says older Flora.
It does say older Flora.
Older Miles.
Yeah.
So like I love spoilers, and I love watching scary things with spoilers. I love watching Marvel stories with spoilers. Like I like knowing the things before they happen. So I always kind of look up the IMDb or the wiki characters, whatever. So I saw this like maybe second episode. I was like, oh, older Flora. But they don't say who the narrator is. So I was still trying to figure out who the narrator was. That would be like at their wedding. But yeah, that like, and that seems like a choice. Like why would they allow such a spoiler to be on the IMDb page? Like someone could just accidentally find that out, and it's supposed to be like a twist or something, or it's supposed to be ambiguous.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that always happens, right? Like let's say in a Marvel movie or something, you know, if there's some twist character, they're probably on the cast list, and you could figure that out ahead of time. So I just thought it was weird that she didn't have an accent. And so that to me was like, maybe Flora, this is not that Flora. This is a different girl who happens to be named Flora. And maybe the story's made up and this is just a wedding gift. Like, here's my story. Because the flip side of that is, let's assume it is Flora, and let's assume she didn't remember any of this. This is not a great thing to drop on someone the night before their wedding.
It's so cruel. And you think she's maybe going to say something when she's like, oh, everybody go to bed. I'm going to stay here with Jamie for a minute. You think she's going to be like something scary. Like she's going to be like, yes, that was me. I know. And like maybe something scary is going to happen. Maybe there's going to be some like twist that makes you think what could happen next. But that doesn't really happen. It's sort of tied up in a very nice, pretty bow. And she's just like, oh, I thought maybe you were making it up because my middle name is Flora. And I don't know what that's supposed to mean.
Is that what she? Yeah, that's what she said.
Yeah.
That was another reason I was like, this is a different person. Interesting.
And then they do the kind of cheesy, like you see everybody dancing and they flash back to their younger selves. And that maybe was a hallucination that Jamie was having. Maybe she was seeing all of these characters in front of her.
I took that as just these are all different people, but they are triggering her.
Yeah.
That's the way I read it. Although I'm on the Wikipedia now and it's like older Owen, older Flora, older Miles, older Henry.
But that's also just the characters that she has decided that they are, and she's the narrator.
Right. It kind of read as the way anthology series work, where someone looks exactly the same, but they're an entirely new character. That's kind of the way I read it, but I don't know.
Yeah.
And they were all played by different people. So
yeah. And it didn't seem like enough time had passed for that to be necessary too. So maybe that is part of it. Maybe that's why they're all played by different people, because they're not those people.
Right. Yeah. That's what I don't know. So the uncle.
Yes. Let's talk about the uncle. So I love the uncle story and I wish we got more of it. This is another thing.
Really? Okay.
I feel this way about Danny's coming out story. I feel this way about the uncle. I feel this way about Peter. There are a lot of things, Owen and Hannah's story, there are a lot of things that are just so good and they really hit some moments for me, but it feels like they just didn't kick up the dirt as much as they could have.
Yeah.
So I think that the uncle is going through something really interesting that I kind of mentioned before. Once Danny is possessed, she believes she is a bad person. There's this thing that's going to come out of her. And I think that that's something that happens with grief a lot. This is something that I recently have started talking about more often. And because I have surrounded myself by a lot of people who have experienced grief, it just so happens that I'm talking to people like that. And then they're like, oh shit, me too. So I have this thing where I'm like, there's this rotten inside version of myself that's just coming out. And maybe this is because, someone I love was taken away from me. Therefore, I must have deserved it. Therefore, I must be a bad person. And therefore, I could never have something good. So even and this is why, Jamie and Danny are a little bit over romanticized for me, because I don't believe that Danny would just take that at face value. I think she believes that she doesn't deserve a happy life. And, maybe that's the Lady of the Lake. That's her manifestation of that. That's her excuse to not end up having a happy life. But that's also what the uncle is doing, right? Like his brother finds out that he's been sleeping with his wife and he's like, you're a bad person. And from that moment forward, we get it. We get why the uncle is such a piece of shit. And why he keeps seeing this version of himself that's like this like kind of manic, intense, like evil, maniacal version of him. That's the version that he believed he was after his brother said that to him. And that's the version that he had to accept that he was once the two people he loved the most died. And it's, you know, like Danny, it's right after something bad happens. It's right after they're found out. And then those people, they never get the chance to find closure with them or to come back together with them. They're taken away from them. So he's left with this evil version of himself, right? Like, there's no way that he could hold the duality of like a person that deserves love and a person that deserves a relationship with his daughter that also effectively killed his lover and his brother,
right,
because of his evil, his inherent evil, rotten person.
So what do you make of his behavior? And namely, I'm talking about his refusal to visit the children, and he would keep calling Flora, or calling the house hoping to talk to Flora. So what do you make of that? Because I want to hear what you think about it.
I mean, I think he refuses to visit because he can't actually face the reality of the situation. It would force him to confront his duality. Like, he lives alone in this world where he can tell himself whatever story he wants about his life, about his loved ones, and about himself. That's, you know, I think he knows that if he were to face the children, he would have to face that version of him. And you see that when he goes at the end to the house, that version of him is scared. That version of him is like trying to get him not to, because he can't possibly hold on to this imagined thing, this
guilty conscience.
Yeah, this guilty conscience, this narrative that he's decided it's like this and that's it. So if he sees the children, he has to accept that he believes in some part of him that he deserves a relationship with those children. So he doesn't physically go there, but he keeps calling her because that is enough distance. And maybe he believes that maybe it's like an OCD situation, right? Where he's like, well, maybe if I call her and she answers, then that's a sign that there's something that I should be thinking about. But if she doesn't answer, then I'm right. Then I'm right about everything, that I can't go there. And it's something that holds way more meaning for him than maybe it actually does. But she never answers the phone, so we don't really know what it would mean for him if she did.
Yep.
And I don't know. I think there's a lot of things that we're just like, well, I guess we don't get to learn anything more about him because that's kind of all we get. And I think that's kind of a disservice to what I think is an interesting narrative that's going on for him.
Yep. His behavior, it's tricky because we know if he was a parental figure to the kids, that would be a positive thing. We know that. But like we're saying, he feels so guilty about being a bad person that he thinks he would be a detriment to those kids. I want to ask you, if you don't mind, what is your religious background?
So I was baptized Methodist. We went to like a very cute little community church when I was a kid in that first house where we saw the ghosts in the hallway, where my father died. And I mean, he didn't actually die there. He died in the hospital, but he was sick there. That's where we lived when it happened. So when we moved to the neighborhood that I'm in now, it was sort of like a fresh start for my mother when she married my stepdad. So we started this whole new life, and we started going to a new church, and it was like an evangelical, like very intense church. And so I think like my most volatile feelings about religion come from that evangelical upbringing. And that's where I was when I was sort of, going through puberty and like coming into myself and trying to understand what queerness meant in relationship to my religion, or what death meant. And I remember like just being so angry all the time, because I was like, how dare you guys tell me how to be when like you haven't experienced this, like and why would God do this to me? And you just keep telling me that God has a plan, and it looks like a pretty fucked up plan to me. Like, so fuck you. And anytime I would express that, they would be like, ooh, too much. Yeah. And we hear this story in Christianity, especially of this like broken soul being like Jesus's favorite person, and I think that comes up in Judaism too. And I'm sure it comes up in a lot of religions where it's like the sinner is this like holy entity, where it's like, that's the person that understands what it's like to be a human. But you don't see that in organized religion. That person is cast out of the community.
Right.
So anyway, that's sort of my relationship to religion.
Okay. So the reason I'm asking, it's hard to explain. I was raised in the Catholic Church, but I was not Catholic on paper, because my parents got divorced at a very young age. So I ended up going to church with my dad, but I never received communion or any of the like Catholic rites of passage, right? So confirmation. Yeah. So I'm kind of in this unique position of like, the only church I've ever gone to has been Catholic, but I never was really part of it. But the reason I'm asking about this is because a big part of certainly my Catholic upbringing, but I think Catholicism in general, and it sounds like kind of the evangelical religion you've experienced, is this idea of original sin, and this idea of everyone who sins is bad, and Jesus is kind of the pinnacle of humanity because he was totally self-sacrificing and he was totally selfless, and anything short of that you need to feel guilty about, and that's a big part of Catholicism, is guilt. So this idea of the uncle is held back by his guilt for what he did to his family, even though the most honorable, most ethical thing to do would be to take the responsibility of taking care of the family. So, it's kind of this impossible position that I've certainly experienced through death. This idea of, I have all this responsibility, and yet the overwhelming emotionality, the grief, all this kind of stuff keeps me from really doing what I need to accomplish, which in his case is taking care of his family.
Yeah. Yeah. You said it.
Cool.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah. And I think we experience that too as survivors. Like, you're left with all these broken people that are grieving, that can't be there for each other often. And like, when my dad died, he had like, I think he has 4 brothers, and I don't have relationships with any of them. And it's like, the good, honorable thing to do would have been to like be present in my life as a child, but like, it's too hard. And I get that, this is another duality where it's like, it's really fucking hard to see his face in my face, I'm sure. And to know that you can't be with him again, and that I'm just a constant reminder of that. But like fuck them for thinking that they can just live outside of that reality, and like, fuck the uncle for doing that to them too.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, this is kind of similar to what I experienced when my mother passed away. At the time, it was, my sisters lived out of state. So it was really just me and my stepdad dealing with it. And it was tough because I wanted to be there for him, to support him, as I'm sure he wanted to be for me, but we were both grieving on our own. And I remember having to like reach out and saying, I'm sorry, I can't come visit. I'm dealing with this, and I'm sure you are too. And I'm sorry I can't support you. Certainly, I think, in the weeks immediately following someone's death, I think that's normal. I think to hold on to that for years is when it turns into a haunting, that I can't support you because I can't even support myself because I'm so grief stricken. I'm so guilty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You want to talk about Peter?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. So Peter is just this abusive boyfriend. He's like a broken, manipulative dude. Um, and we learn enough about him to know that he has some sort of trauma in his life. His dad did something terrible to him, and I don't think we end up finding out exactly what that is, but we can imagine all of the possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore he has become this scary version of himself, this abusive guy. And okay, so I have dated abusive dudes. I like went straight into it. Like my first boyfriend when I was 14 was really abusive. He was really verbally abusive, and he used to like threaten to kill himself if I didn't do certain things. And he would gaslight me a lot, and I didn't know what that meant back then. And then I ended up dating another dude that was really similar when I was 18, 19, right after graduating high school and going into college. So I was going off to school in New York City, and I had this guy that I was attached to back here in Phoenix, New York.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very much like Peter, and there were things that Peter said that I was like, ooh, that happened to me. The thing where Owen feeds her and he's like, oh, so you're just going to let anybody put anything in your mouth? Like, I think I had that exact thing happen to me. And I don't even think it was like someone was feeding me. I think it was probably something that he made up that happened. Yeah. But the moment where he says all of that stuff, and it's probably to most viewers the most extreme he gets. And I can imagine someone who hasn't experienced that type of person being like, oh, like that's crazy. Why would anybody react that way? But I was like, that's actually the most accurate representation throughout the whole show of Peter's character. I think that they actually dilute his character throughout the rest of the scenes. Mm-hmm. And, maybe part of that is to show his entire humanity. And we do see it. We see it in his memory of his mother coming back, asking for money, all of that. We do see a lot of Peter's whole self. But I think there's something in his relationship with Rebecca that I don't believe. I think that Rebecca is represented to us as a really like independent person who like knows what she wants, and she's like doing it. And I can only speak to my experience, but like my Peter, who was very much like Peter, he was a broken person, and like that's what I attached myself to. And I just don't see Rebecca as someone that wants to fix somebody. I don't see Rebecca as like super vulnerable. We don't learn anything about her that like clicks. It's not like she has a dead dad. It's not like she has any daddy issues that we know of, like she doesn't really have a thing that allows him to sneak into her life that way. Like, why is she haunted by him? Something that like my therapist and I talk about with my Peter is like, there was a door open for him. I wasn't just living like my normal life and he just swooped in. Like there were a lot of conditions set for him to be able to play that part in my life. Mm-hmm. And I don't see those conditions for Rebecca.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to make too many assumptions. I've had somewhat abusive relationships in the past, where I would say there was some gaslighting and things like that. But I guess I'm curious. Do you think it's unrealistic? Because I felt like she was a little too in his grip. Like it felt like maybe some of this gaslighting. Like I don't know why she didn't tell him to fuck off, honestly. And I know part of that may be that's the way abusive relationships work, and so I don't want to speak out of turn, but when it was so extreme, he was leaving at this point. So I was like, it seems like a pretty easy. I don't know why she fought so hard to keep him, I guess.
Yeah.
And we're not, yeah.
Yeah, this is another thing we're missing from Bly. This is just another one of those narratives that they don't really dig into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they could have easily, because they kind of just like hooked up, and then pretty much after they slept together the first time, he started gaslighting her. And I'm sure that there are people who have this experience, but it felt like it could have been written a little more gradually, where he kind of chips away at her. I also want to say I was really grossed out by everyone sharing the same spoon. That really bugged me.
You're like, I get it, Peter. That's so fucked up. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think that there are always tells. There are always like little red flags in the beginning that you're like, oh, well, he's so charming. Like, I'm sure that wasn't anything. And then it's like there's so little that you diminish them, and then they start to grow and you keep diminishing them, and you're just so used to it that by the time they're these huge things, you're just like, oh, it's not that big of a deal.
Right. It's like boiling a frog, right? That's what they not that I've done that, but but you know what I'm talking about?
Mm-mm.
Oh, so
No.
so there's an expression about boiling frogs where the idea is if you put a frog in boiling water, it will freak out. But if you put a frog in room temperature water and then start to boil it, it will just, because it's gradually increasing, it will never start to freak out until it's dead, basically.
Yes. Okay. So exactly. But so that's what they should have been doing with Peter, is gradually increasing the temperature. And it seemed to go from like, him grabbing her arm after they hooked up the first time. I was like, okay, yeah, that's one of the tells, but she is going to explain it away. But then like from there, he goes to like 50. Yeah. And then from there, he goes to 100. It's just like, it's kind of like Danny and Jamie, like they have one bump and then all of a sudden they're perfect. Yep. Like that doesn't feel right. And she does push back on him. She's like, you don't talk to me that way. And then all of a sudden he's talking to her that way again. And she's just like, okay. All of a sudden she's possessed by him. And I don't know if that's what they were getting at. Like when he comes back and tells her to pack her bags and get ready to go, and she's just all in. And I don't see the progression there. That seemed like a huge jump.
Yeah. I mean, I did, I liked the way he was written. I think it was, so often we will see an abusive person and it's just like, they're just physically abusive. And not saying that that doesn't happen, but I think a lot of abuse is emotional or, gaslighting like we're talking about. And the fact that he was so evil without ever, I don't think he ever really physically, like he grabbed her arm, sure, and that's abusive, but in the classic Hollywood way, he never punched her in the face or anything. Right. So I liked that we saw how terrible he was without really physically hurting her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, he was very well written. And I think there's something here that I always go back to Jessica Jones when I talk about abusive relationships and representation in media. Have you seen it, the show?
I have not. Okay. I should.
It's really good. Yeah. I think the first season is perfect. And I'm not even like, I know I already referenced Marvel once. I'm not really like a huge Marvel person, or like, we just happened to watch it. And I think Kristen Ritter is the actress's name. She's like very hot, very much have a crush on her. So I was like, okay, let's watch this thing. And I was like crying. I was like, I don't know, when you were explaining your experience, like watching the dementia narrative unfold, like I was like, holy shit, this is my abuse narrative unfolding.
Mm-hmm.
And what I love about Jessica Jones is that the villain, his power is mind control, but he, as Jessica's abusive partner, never really uses that on her.
Who is it?
He's the guy from
No, I mean like in the show.
Oh, what's his name? That's a really good question.
I'll look it up. Because I haven't read any Jessica Jones. I've read some of Iron Fist, and I know he's part of the Defenders with Jessica Jones.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of crossover with Daredevil and Luke Cage.
Yeah, I've read some Daredevil. I have not read Luke Cage.
Yeah.
Is Luke Cage her partner? No.
He becomes her partner, but he's a good guy. The villain. It's like on the tip of my tongue. I'm so bad with names. But he's played
Kilgrave?
Yes, Kilgrave.
Okay. Yep.
Okay, so we got it. So like, yeah, Kilgrave has this superpower of being able to manipulate people and control them. But like, it's like what I talked about with ghost stories, where it's like you don't need the ghost in a good ghost story. It's
right.
So people are haunted by their own realities, and Jessica Jones is like haunted by the emotional manipulation and abuse that he's able to inflict on her without even using his superpower. And that's like, oh, it's so good. It's just such a good, okay, so I digress, but that's really like one of the only other representations of an abusive partner in media that I've like latched onto and been like, that's it. Peter in the spoon feeding scene, that's also it. Like these extremes are like so real. And now I'm like forgetting where I'm going with this. So like maybe you might have to edit this entire rant out. But we were talking about the jump, right? The jump from like he seems harmless to like he's fully inside of her, right?
Right.
And
she never seemed to resist his abuse, which again, I'm sure that there's something there, you know, in an abusive relationship. Part of it is not to suggest that it's the victim's fault, but a lot of times you are gaslit into staying in that relationship, right?
Yes, exactly. And they're acting on fears that you already have usually too. Like, yeah. And I think
did she have a backstory?
Jessica Jones?
No, not Jessica Jones. Rebecca.
I'm obsessed. Rebecca.
Next weekend we'll do a Marvel call.
Okay, let's do it. Rebecca, like not really. And that sucked. Like I wanted more from her. Like maybe I'm not remembering, but it seemed like she really wanted to be a lawyer.
Showed up.
Yeah. She thought she could like get in with the uncle by being a nanny. Yeah, like her whole thing was like she was sexually abused in law school, I think. So maybe that's supposed to be a little bit of a seed. But even in those stories, she seems to reject it. Like she seems to understand. She is not gaslit by those experiences or those people. So again, like we're working under this assumption that she like gets it, that she's not going to be fooled by him. Like she's not a great vessel for his haunting, right? You know? I don't know.
Yeah. And then he kills her, which I thought was interesting. I thought that was, I really liked that concept of he like kind of tricked her in order to kill her, in order to
hold her hostage with him forever.
Yeah. And I think, so I guess this goes back to kind of one of my questions is, what do we think the split is between him being, so like when he's freaking out about the spoon feeding, right? How much of that do we think is him fabricating an incident versus is he actually jealous? Does he actually believe there's an issue here?
I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I believe. And, this is speaking to an experience of being haunted by an abusive relationship where like you try so hard to figure out why they are that way and what they were experiencing versus what you were experiencing with their abuse. So yeah, like with my Peter, like I'm still like, it's been a long time, like wondering, was any of that real, or was he just trying to make me believe something so that I would believe I was a bad person and I deserved whatever I was being given with him? He was creating a reality where I couldn't question him, where he could be, and he was also a very broken person like Peter, who, maybe believed that he wasn't worth a lot, or maybe believed that he didn't deserve a lot of things. So he was trying to make Rebecca into a person who did deserve him, who believed that she was not great, that she never deserved to be a lawyer or anything more than a girl who was getting abused.
I see. Yeah.
So I think that there's that going on. And I think, he was jealous too, probably, because he also sees Owen, who's like, I mean, I think awesome. Like Owen is
Owen's the best.
I love Owen. Yeah. And, Owen's this really sweet guy that meant nothing wrong. He has pretty good boundaries. He's like, really nice and takes care of everybody.
Yeah.
And to Peter, that's a threat, because that's a representation of the type of guy that he's never going to get to be, because he has all of this trauma and all of this baggage. And instead of trying to work through that and maybe become somebody more like Owen, or somebody who could be a really good caretaker, he lashes out and he creates a world around him where he's allowed to be a child, and he's allowed to be this version of himself that doesn't seek help. It's like me before going to therapy. Like I was like, I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to ignore it. Like if I just keep ignoring it, then I'm not that person. And I can just keep lashing out at other people, or like believing that it's, this delusion is real.
Yeah. So I could go on forever, probably.
I know there's so much,
but I feel like we're coming up on like 2 hours. And just the reality of how much people are willing to watch. Is there anything we didn't get to that you want to talk about? Any final thoughts?
I think we covered everything. What about you?
There was Owen's, a couple things. Owen's, so this kind of deals with the OCD situation. I'm actually wondering if the writer of this had OCD or something, because there are so many themes there. But in any case, the one night he doesn't go home to be with his mother is the night she dies.
Yeah.
And I know that he will carry that as guilt, this idea of, oh, well, she died because I wasn't with her, because she didn't have anyone there, so she gave up, or whatever the case may be. And that's something that, when I was in Owen's position taking care of my mother with dementia, that was always in the back of my mind, is like, oh, if I go on a vacation this weekend, what if she dies while I'm gone? Um, so I thought that was really interesting. There's a certain kind of poetry there that the one night he doesn't go back is the night she dies. And of course, he's trying to do the right thing by taking care of these kids and by staying to protect the people from Peter. Um, and again, we kind of run into this duality of she, as someone with dementia, is an obligation, is a responsibility. And by moving on, by passing away, she is actually, in some sense, allowing Owen to take better care of the people who need him, you know, because she certainly needs him, but she is on her way out. I feel like every time I talk about death, I feel like I'm doing it so insensitively.
I mean, we are both people that have dealt with it, so it's like
I'm trying to be sensitive, but at the same time, like it's a thing that happens, you know.
And you're speaking to your reality, like you don't owe yourself sensitivity in that, you know, like unless, I mean, you do owe yourself sensitivity, but like you can speak to your reality however it is for you.
Yeah. And then the story time. I don't know if you really latched onto this, but the night that Owen's mother dies, the children are doing the little play where they are puppets, and then the puppet master goes away, and then they forget that they're puppets. So when he comes back, they make fun of him because he thinks they're puppets, but they're not puppets. And I think there's, you know, we talked so much about losing your identity, and losing memories, and in that story, they lost their identity as puppets, which in some ways allowed them to reclaim their new identity as real children. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I had forgotten about that part.
I had too, until I was reading the Wikipedia page. I'm sure there's a lot to unpack there. But I again, I didn't like spend a ton of time thinking about it, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I remember kind of being like, where did this come from? It sort of felt out of place and might have been why I don't really remember it. Mm-hmm. Like my brain just couldn't latch it onto anything else that was happening around. And obviously there are themes there that they're trying to talk about. But like the fact that my brain omitted it from the story, I think is interesting. And I don't know. So like, okay, Flora was dressed up as a cat and Miles was dressed up as a puppet and they were on the stairs. Okay. So what was Flora's identity in that story?
I'm trying to remember, because I feel like, did they each tell a story? Because I feel like Miles's was much more, Miles's was the like puppet thing.
Yeah. And it was intense and it like took a turn.
Yeah, it was very dark, which I thought was cool. I think there's value in adults allowing children to creatively express their grief. And that's going to get uncomfortable at times. And I think the fact that the adults allowed the children to express themselves that way was very cool.
And then right as everybody's getting uncomfortable with the puppet story, they receive the phone call about Owen's mother, right?
Yep.
Well, what did you make of it?
I thought it was interesting. Again, I think like stories within stories are very cool to me, because you can do a lot. Obviously, I kind of do a little bit of that on my YouTube channel. I try to start every video with like a myth or a legend that reflects the larger point that I'm talking about. So the idea of putting this kind of boiled down story that serves as a microcosm for the greater story, you can kind of get away with this reductionist story that we end up with, that these puppets are made into puppets and then they forget that they're puppets. And then, so I thought it was a nice reflection of the larger story of, you know, you losing your identity and how memory is tied into that. And, you know, maybe the puppet maker in the story is representative of losing someone. And when you lose someone, you lose part of yourself and your identity changes, because now you have to reassess where you're at. You know, I'm certainly a different person than I was 5 years ago. And a lot of that has to do with the grief that I've experienced.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I thought it was cool. I thought it was nice and creepy and a fun way to put the spotlight on the kids.
Yeah. Yeah. It did feel like, even though it was a very intense and like kind of scary moment, you were sort of waiting for a jump scare or some ghost or monster to come out. It really was just the kids and the characters being themselves and actually having a moment that felt real. It was kind of like a moment of levity, even in its darkness, right before this very scary and sad reality of Owen's mother passing is revealed to them. And I think that it allows you to sort of experience this. Maybe it's guilt of like, Owen was laughing and, you know, participating in this family while being away from his mother. And you see, it's like, you know, as soon as I allow myself to laugh, something bad is going to happen. And I'm going to be angry at myself for laughing. You know, like you hold on so tightly to like, I cannot experience joy because I know that with joy, I'm going to have something in the opposite direction. It's
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you've experienced this, but you kind of have this armor of, I need to be ready at any second for this person to die. And that means that, you know, one thing I struggle with is like, if I, you know, for example, I would be scared to watch a certain movie because if at that point is when I get the call, then that movie's going to be ruined. Or if the movie's funny, it was bad that I was having a happy moment when someone died. I just had a thought, which I thought was really good, but I lost it. Yeah, just this idea of like Owen letting his guard down for a second. And of course, that's when it happens. And to your point, I think there's some guilt of, because I wasn't there, that's why it happened. Just like with Danny, you know, because she got in a fight with her boyfriend, because she's queer, that's why her boyfriend died or her fiance died. Yeah, I think, you know, I really felt for Owen's character a lot throughout this. Yeah, I think honestly his eulogy was the most powerful part of the whole show for me, because again, you don't really get the caretaker's perspective. It's always the perspective of the person with dementia, and getting the perspective of someone who's trying to cope, who's trying to rationalize, who's trying to understand, was really powerful. And there was a lot in there that resonated with me about The way he talked about his mother and the way he talked about his experiences.
Yeah. There's a moment, I think it's in Hannah's episode, where Owen says something about how when we lose our memories, we lose our identities, we lose ourselves. And then what are we when we don't have our memories? And I feel like that moment was really like that entire episode summed up in a
Well,
sense.
I would even say I feel like that's the thesis for the whole series.
Yeah.
Even the Lady of the Lake, as she got further and further from her original time, she was losing her memory, her purpose, and her identity. Owen's mother's dementia, of course, Hannah kind of phasing in and out of different memories. And I think I wholeheartedly agree with that assessment that, once a person loses their memories, they're just a physical entity. And then that's what you're taking care of. You're no longer taking care of the person you loved. And, I've been watching Hellstrom, which is another Marvel series. And it's about a lot of demon possession. And it's this idea of once you are possessed, are you really still there? Jump scares. There weren't many jump scares in the show, which I appreciate. I don't like jump scares.
Yeah. Yeah. But we were watching, waiting for it, kind of, which I think is an interesting kind of experience, living, waiting for the jump scare and then not experiencing it.
Well, and you could argue that that is reflective of kind of the theme of terminal illness, of you're waiting for this big moment, but really it's going to drag on until it just ends.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to have to do some research about the writer, or like somebody must have had a relationship with dementia. There's too much there.
I would like to read the original text, and which I could have done before this, but I didn't. And I'm interested also because it was written, I think it was written in 1898. So I'm sure it was written in a much different context of mental health and mental illness and understanding of dementia and understanding of grief even. So I would be interested to see how they dealt with that. And I think I would argue that that probably inspired a lot of the way the show handles it, where memory and identity and the afterlife are all intertwined, because the story comes from a time when we didn't really understand as much. So it was all kind of this complex mysticism. But yeah, I mean, I'll probably read it shortly, and then if you're interested, we can do another episode on Hill House once I watch that.
Yes, I want you to watch that so that we can. But when you're ready, because what you said about like sitting with Bly Manor really hit me, because I was sitting with Hill House for a very, very long time.
Yeah. And that I experienced that with Midsummer, where it took me like 4 weeks to process Midsummer.
I haven't watched it, and I don't know if I'll ever be ready.
No, I mean, it's challenging, especially since you have lost a parent. I will say I've watched it twice now, and the second time it was a breeze. But the first time I watched it, and then I sat with it for about a month before I was really able to move on from it. So it's a challenging film. It's excellent. It's very good. It makes you think. But yeah. So thank you so much for joining me. Do you wanna plug yourself? Do you wanna give your Instagram or whatever? I don't know. Whatever
Yeah,
you want to
sure.
do.
Sure. Yeah. So my Instagram at Bridget Badore, I post my photography. I also post a lot about therapy.
Mhm.
And I try to, I guess, like engage with folks about that. So that's been a fun little practice. That's definitely, I think, helped me to understand what I'm getting from therapy too.
Mhm.
I mean, like we met through MySpace. We grew up in a time where we were very much figuring out what our identities meant on the internet.
Yep.
So I think like I've carried that a lot, and like it's come out a lot in how I understand my process in therapy. And I think I was very nervous to talk about it online, but it became really powerful and like a really important part of it for me. And I think a lot of that does have to do with growing up, figuring out your identity in relationship to MySpace, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram.
Well, and to that point, I feel like since I've started doing these YouTube videos, and you hear people say this all the time, right? Is that like, I'm kind of playing a character, certainly. But also part of it is like, I'm kind of figuring out who I am. And it's like this idea of, if I strip away everything else, if I have no hometown, if I have no family, no friends, it's just me on a camera, what do I present to the world? And by putting myself through that exercise, I'm actually learning a lot about myself and who I want to be and who I am. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. And who you are performing for too.
Exactly.
Yep. Yeah. So it's interesting. So that's, if anybody decides to follow me on Instagram, that's a lot of what you're getting. And yeah, you can find anything else about me through there. I also, pre-COVID used to host a lot of in-person grief groups, and I would do something called Dead Parents Club. And I am working on trying to do that digitally. So anyone's watching this that can relate to our experiences, message me and we can talk about it, and you can come talk about it with other people eventually once I get my shit together.
Yeah. I'd love to be part of the Dead Parents Club. That's what I always have to, whenever I learn that someone's parent has died, I always have to not say welcome to the Dead Parents Club because that feels shitty. But it's like after a couple of months, you get kind of that irreverence to it. I don't know. You just it's just a part of who you are, right? So well, thank you so much for joining me. Let's do this again.
Yeah. Cool. I would love to. This is fun. Thank you for sharing so much of your experiences with me.
Cool. And thanks for watching, everyone. Like, comment, subscribe, you know the deal, and check out Bridget's Instagram.